Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jerry Firestein, Senior Vice President here at the Middle East Institute, and we want to thank you for joining us today for a joint book talk with Noura Erakat and Khaled Elgindy. Many thanks to the George and Rhonda Salem Family Foundation for supporting the lecture series, and thanks especially to Mr. George Salem for being with us today. In recent days, the Trump administration has announced that it will hold an international workshop on Palestinian economic development in partnership with the government of Bahrain. The workshop, to be conducted in Manama in late June, is set to be the first part of its so-called deal of the century. A second political component of the deal is promised for a later, as yet unspecified date. Although details of the plan remain obscure, and members of the team continue to insist that it should not be prejudged on the basis of unverified reports, nevertheless, Jared Kushner and other members of the team have revealed significant aspects of what they intend. Kushner has insisted that the team drew up its proposal having conducted an exhaustive assessment of the history of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and that what they will propose is something new and different. But the reality is the key elements of the plan will almost certainly look familiar to anyone who has tracked the history of peace negotiations. In fact, what Kushner's team will put on the table is most likely an approach that has been tried and failed repeatedly over the past decades. Much of that failure can be attributed to the control that the United States has maintained in the peacemaking process and its biased application of law and policy to Israelis and Palestinians based on its determination to protect Israel's regional security, political, and economic domination. Today's conversation will look at how the unequal application of law and diplomacy have both prevented establishment of a just and lasting peace and strangled Palestinian governance and society. We're very fortunate to have with us today two outstanding scholars on the history of the peace process. Khaled Elgindy is currently a non-resident fellow at the Center of Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute and a founding board member of the Egyptian-American Rule of Law Association. Khaled has served in the past as an advisor to both the Palestinian leadership and the U.S. government. His new book, Blind Spot, America and the Palestinians from Balfour to Trump, provides a thorough detail of the ways in which U.S. policies have failed to confront Israeli occupation and engage productively in the peacemaking space. Noura Erakat is a Palestinian-American legal scholar and human rights attorney. Noura is a co-founding editor of Judicial, an electronic magazine on the Middle East, and serves on the boards of the Institute for Policy Studies and the Arab Studies Institute. Her new book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, details the history of Palestine through a legal framework, examining the ways in which international legal frameworks continue to fail Palestinians. You can read full biographic information on the two panelists on today's flyer. Before we begin, please remember to silence your mobile devices, but feel free to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag MEIPalestine. Thank you again, and please join me in welcoming our panelists. To begin, we're going to ask Khaled Elgindy to come and make some introductory remarks.
Thank you, Jerry, and to all my friends at the Middle East Institute. I'm especially pleased to be here with my good friend Noura Erakat. We've been talking for many years, even as we were immersed in our respective book projects on the kind of synergy between our two projects, and that someday we should do something together. So I'm thrilled that we were finally able to do that. I want to give a sort of overview of the main part of my book, which is kind of how essentially, if I can put it in a snarky way, how the peace process basically killed the two-state solution. As most of you know, the peace process is dead, but it was not Donald Trump who killed it. It was more a process of kind of death by 1,000 cuts, in which all American administrations, starting with Bill Clinton, but especially George Bush, contributed to the kind of slow, agonizing death of this process, such that by the time we got to Barack Obama, he basically let it bleed out, essentially. He didn't necessarily contribute to killing it, but he sort of left it to hemorrhage, and it effectively died on his watch. I think what our two books have in common is this idea of how power and power asymmetry in particular distorts processes in ways that effectively turn them into the opposite of what they are designed to do. Noura, of course, will talk about the law and how the law is used not as a way to help the weak and the most vulnerable, but actually to how the law has been used disproportionately against the weak. In that same way, the peace process became, for all intents and purposes, a way to preserve the power asymmetry between Israelis and Palestinians, and hence maintain the status quo. So let me explain what I mean by that. Why did the Oslo process fail? The Oslo process failed. The failure of the Oslo process had a great deal to do with the unique nature of American mediation. In particular, American mediation since the Oslo process has been based on two faulty assumptions. The first was that peace can only come when Israel feels secure militarily and politically. Only in that instance will Israeli leaders be able to make, quote, risks for peace, and therefore make concessions to the Palestinians. The other faulty assumption that never panned out was the idea that Palestinian internal politics could somehow be ignored, neutralized, or perhaps even re-engineered to suit the needs of the peace process. These are the two aspects. Both of these aspects kind of reflect the two sides of what I refer to as the blind spot, which is an American blind spot in relation to power and politics, specifically Israeli power and Palestinian politics. So on the one hand, there's this tendency to downplay the power asymmetry, to treat the two parties as though they were co-equals. If we can just get them back to the negotiating table. How many times have we heard that refrain from various administrations, while ignoring the realities beyond the negotiations that clearly affect the process. Many of you remember, 14 or 15 years ago when Israeli tanks were surrounding the headquarters of the PLO leader Yasser Arafat. That was negotiations by other means, very clearly. That never happened in Israeli-Syrian negotiations. There was no counterpart in Egyptian-Israeli negotiations. This is a very real dynamic when you're talking about the power asymmetry and how an occupier negotiates with the occupied population. And yet this was kind of glossed over by American policymakers. The second aspect, it has to do with politics. We all understand that American policymakers have this ultra sensitivity to Israeli politics, to Israeli internal coalition workings, who's in, who's out of the coalition. If we raise the issue of Jerusalem, who will bolt, who will leave the coalition and bring down the government? If we talk about a settlement freeze, what will that mean? We understand instinctively that when any side is negotiating, they're bringing to the negotiations their opposition, their public opinion, their historical narratives, except when it comes to the Palestinians. Those things get completely sort of filtered out. So this is, of course, is not accidental. The U.S. approach was shaped by its own power in politics. There is something about a superpower interacting with a non-state actor. You can only imagine how in a sense, blind, really, the superpower is to the needs. What possible, what could the Palestinians bring to the table that could compel the Americans to pay attention to their nuances of their politics or their historical narratives? And at the same time, of course, we are all familiar with the special relationship and the nature of the influence of the pro-Israel lobby. These are what shaped American involvement in the process. In practice, this has meant two things. The first is that there is this constant tension, and this is actually a tension that goes back 100 years, between, on the one hand, what American policymakers, specifically in the State Department and in the intelligence community, believe are the needs of the peace process. This is what is needed to bring stability in the region, to protect American interests. There's that on one hand. And on the other hand, there are the demands of domestic politics, which are pulling in a different direction. And so we end up, time and time again, really, I think every administration for 100 years has battled with these competing forces. And what we end up with is a very ambivalent American approach in which U.S. policy is often working both for and against its own objectives at the same time. The second trend has to do with the fact that the two strongest parties, who are bound together by a special relationship, had both the means and the motive to shift as many of the political risks and costs away from themselves and from one another and onto the Palestinians as possible. This is just built into, this is a structural issue. When something goes wrong, like the collapse of the Camp David summit, the first instinct of the President of the United States is not to blame himself, certainly, and it's not to blame his special relationship with his close ally Israel, but you can always blame the Palestinians. It's always easier and less costly to blame the Palestinians. We see this happen time and time again. When things go wrong, flare-ups of violence, you deflect from yourself, deflect your own responsibility, and onto the weaker side, which was consistently, of course, the Palestinians. Over time, this takes a toll. So every president, every administration really has gone through this process of working both for and against the goals of the peace process. I mentioned Clinton, and I would say, just to sort of balance out the conversation on Bill Clinton, Clinton sort of represented both the best and the worst of what American mediation had to offer. But at the end of the day, what mattered most was what happened after Camp David and the outbreak of the Palestinian uprising, in which all of the blame essentially was put on one side. That said, I would say no U.S. administration has done more, I think, lasting damage to the prospects of a negotiated two-state solution than that of George W. Bush. Here, the list is quite long. I'm just going to make a couple specific references. On the one hand, the Bush administration was the first to officially call for the creation of a Palestinian state to make a two-state solution official U.S. policy. On the other hand, George W. Bush basically gave Ariel Sharon a green light to destroy the Palestinian Authority, its governing and security institutions, during the course of the Intifada from 2000 until 2003 or 4. So again, sort of working for and against your own goals at the same time. And what is interesting about the Bush administration is that it's sort of a return to a previous mindset that I trace back to Henry Kissinger, which viewed Palestinian politics as such as a pathology, as something that needed to be fixed or cured, and then that would enable peace. This is an idea that begins with Kissinger. Of course, it has roots going all the way back to the Balfour Declaration, but it begins with Henry Kissinger, and it blossoms really during the George Bush administration. And so the idea is that you can't have peace until the Palestinians reform. They have to change. They have to change their leadership. In fact, is what the Bush administration had said. The biggest test really for the Bush administration was the Hamas election, which very much like the Intifada and the collapse of Camp David was sort of a sign that the peace process was not well. The fact that Hamas, a violent movement that had used violence against civilians repeatedly in order to disrupt the process, the fact that they had won this election to an institution that was created by Oslo was clearly a paradox and had a lot to do with the failings of the peace process. But once again, all of the costs were placed on the Palestinians. There was a boycott of the PA. Sanctions brought the PA to its knees, essentially, and eventually led to a Palestinian civil war. So by the time we get to Barack Obama, the peace process is in a total shambles. It's hemorrhaging. Obama is, in my view, and I wrote this back then, was the last best hope for a negotiated two-state solution. But he didn't seize the many opportunities that he had. He came to office just after the Gaza war, massive death and destruction by Israel. There was no real U.S. Involvement in the process of bringing about a ceasefire. Netanyahu is now back in power. The settlement project is an enormous success. And like I said, Obama had a number of opportunities to reverse or arrest these various trends, but consistently chose not to, consistently chose the path of least resistance. And so when the peace process was dying, the two-state solution was dying and needed a radical change, he essentially kept things in a holding pattern. So that by the time we get to, or before I get to Trump, in short, the peace process failed because it was totally detached from reality, especially in terms of dealing with the occupation. Successes and compliance by Palestinians, for example, did not lead to any rewards. And by the same token, failures and violations by Israel did not bring any costs. The absence of pressure on Israel did not make Israel more willing to take, quote, risks for peace, but actually defrayed the costs of the occupation militarily, financially, and otherwise. Likewise, the constant pressure on Palestinian leaders did make them more pliant, but also made them too weak to serve as effective peace partners. As we now see, we have this divided and dysfunctional Palestinian leadership of highly questionable legitimacy that is unable to move forward with a peace process. And this was true even during Obama. The inertia of the Obama years basically left an opening for Trump, who is not committed to either the goals or the ground rules of the peace process. We're no longer talking about a two-state solution, certainly not talking about Resolution 242 and Land for Peace. We saw what happened with the Golan Heights, and many are expecting the same with regard to the West Bank, some form of annexation by Israel that the United States would either acquiesce in or actively endorse. And it's not even clear that this administration believes that there is an occupation. So all of the old rules don't really even apply. The peace plan, as Jerry pointed out, we don't know the details, but we know the broad outlines. We know, for example, that Jerusalem is off the table because the president told us that. We know that refugees are off the table because, frankly, they've been off the table since the beginning of the Oslo process, but especially since the cutting of elimination of U.S. funding to UNRWA. We have no reason to believe that the goal is a sovereign Palestinian state. In fact, now the administration is saying that they're moving away from the idea of two states. So the reality is that Trump is trying to redefine the conflict by turning back the clock, not to the pre-Oslo period, but actually to the period before 1967, when the Palestinians were viewed almost exclusively as an economic, humanitarian, and a security problem rather than a political one. The bottom line is that while I don't necessarily believe that an American-led peace process was doomed to fail, I think it's pretty clear, at least to me, that the current outcome was always more likely than some sort of negotiated breakthrough. The last thing I'll say is, because I think it's important to not let the Palestinian leadership off the hook, because Palestinians obviously have agency and they've been a willing participant in this process across the board. Both Hamas and Fatah, I believe, have failed in their respective projects. Hamas's armed resistance has been an abject failure, and at the same time, Fatah and the PA and the PLO project of negotiations and diplomacy has also been a failure. But the lion's share of the blame, I think, has to fall on the PLO leadership, because they are the leaders. Mahmoud Abbas is the chairman of the PLO, not Ismail Haniyeh and not any other faction. But really, the two big failings of the PLO, I believe, has been, over the past 40 years, has been the exclusive reliance on American deliverance, that somehow the United States would deliver Israel and eventually lead to a Palestinian state, to the exclusion of all other strategies. And so they have no plan B, which is why they're currently sort of flailing, because the American-led peace process is now over and they have no alternative strategy. The other failing, I think, has been to pursue that project outside of a basic political national consensus among the factions, the Palestinian factions, which had been the trademark of the PLO up until the 1980s. And since the Oslo project began, the peace process became sort of a substitute for internal domestic legitimacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled. Thank you to the Middle East Institute. This is indeed, thank you to George Salem and the Randa and George Salem Foundation for hosting this lecture series and inviting me to be a part of it. One of the ways, writing a book is incredibly depressing. You're very isolated, you don't know the way out, you're constantly in argument and with no one else but your own self. And one of the things that actually got me through it was in conversation with Khaled as we commiserated about the process, and the vision that one day the book would come into life, which it is, now both of them, and that we would be in conversation with one another. So thank you for allowing us to realize part of our survival tactics. The thesis of my book is a little bit different than the way that it was presented. I want to alter slightly what you said by, there is one way that realists or pessimists of the law think of the law, which is that law is power. So that might makes right, and at best, law is a political fiction that, in the words of jurist and advocate Richard Falk, is a baton with which to bash your adversaries and make it look legal. And while law does have that impact, in my book, I argue that it's not that simple. But yes, the law is politics. But because of its indeterminacy, meaning that the law has no set meaning on its face, it has to be subject to some sort of legal adjudication and then subject to judicial interpretation before it's applied. If the law was simply prescriptive in the way that we read it, we wouldn't need lawyers. We would need literate people, right? But that's why it becomes so contentious. And it's precisely why the law changes in meaning over time and space, even though the content of it hasn't changed. So think about the law of self-determination. In the aftermath of the First World War, it was actually a tool to ensure ongoing colonial penetration into the Ottoman and German provinces. of the vanquished empires. By 1960, national liberation movements had changed self-determination into a legal right equivalent to national independence. The language didn't change, but what changes over time is how we interpret it, the historical context, the balance of power, and the legal strategy of the workers. So I argue that the law is politics, and in order to serve a progressive cause, it must be wielded in the sophisticated service of a political movement, which is why even though stateless and against a formidable adversary, Israel's unique ally, the only nuclear power in the Middle East, the 11th most powerful military in the world, the PLO was able to create new law during the 1970s in order to further their cause for liberation by creating alternatives to 242, by legislating the right to fight that's captured in the additional protocols 1 and 2 that actually counters the narrative that Palestinian resort to armed violence is terroristic rather than a legitimate form of warfare, in the resolution 3379, condemning Zionism as a form of racism, and so on and so forth. So if we were to just accept that might makes right, we could not make sense of the ways that Palestinians have also used the law. But I show that on balance, it has done much more to further Israel's interest rather than Palestinians. So despite a lot of talk about how Palestinians resort to legal strategies as somehow lawfare, or right, legal terrorism, warfare, the truth of the matter is that the law has done more to serve Israel. It has been able to entrench its settlement infrastructure in the West Bank as a result of occupation law and not in spite of it. It has been able to kill, now the last in 2014, 2,200 Palestinians, and not been subject during Operation Protective Edge over 51 days, and not be subject to any accountability processes, not because Israel got away with it, but in fact, because it has steadily worked to reshape the laws of war in order to expand its right to force and to shrink the category of who counts as a Palestinian civilian. What I call as a shrinking civilian. So Israel has not gotten away with it. What they've done in Gaza is propose new laws for the rest of the world in order to be able to continue this kind of warfare. They're making new proposition for the laws of war. New propositions for the laws of war. So then what is the law doing, if not dictating an outcome or punishing transgressions? I'll give you the example, one brief example that I use in my introduction, which is how we responded to Security Council Resolution 2334 in December 2016, hailed as a Palestinian victory because the US abstained from using its veto and basically affirmed that settlement construction in the West Bank is illegal as a matter of law. They hadn't done so since 1980. Right? This was celebrated as a victory. And yet, obviously, we see Israel continue its settlement expansion with little else to be done. In July 2017, the UN ESQA issued a report that was drafted by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley that basically said that Israel's regulation of Palestinian life is tantamount to apartheid without distinction to the Palestinians in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or Israel proper, or the refugees. In that moment, the report was shelved. If you read it, it's because it was leaked. And Rima Khalaf, the head of UN ESQA, resigned in protest. And the Palestinian leadership continued to point to 2334 and has not uplifted the UN ESQA report. Neither the Security Council resolution or the report have dictated the path forward, but the fact that the Palestinian leadership and the international community shelved the report condemning Israel's regulation of Palestinian life as apartheid and calling for pressure to pressure Israel to change its behavior, shelving that report while upholding 2334 has shaped our diplomatic treatment of the issue so that we insist on approaching this as approximating a two-state solution, notwithstanding the empirical evidence, painstakingly narrated right now by Khaled as well as in his book, right? And that we know if any of us looked at a map today, we could tell you, why are we having this conversation? Why are we discussing the deal of the century today instead of the fact that we're entering the 60th week of mass civil protest of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who have been protesting non-violently in what should inspire the entire world to think about new futures. A population that has been subject to near starvation. They cannot move even for medical treatment. They cannot leave the Gaza Strip to become refugees of war, and yet still they are the ones that are continuing to lead a path forward, a resistance path to freedom using nonviolent means, which should make us all celebrate, because everybody keeps asking, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Here you have 45,000 Palestinians for 60 weeks showing you they're there, and we choose to ignore them, and instead we want to continue to ask the same question, what about the two-state solution? Right? That's also a reflection of the power of law and the way that it applies. How does it apply to the deal of the century? So it's taken too long, so now I have to truncate this part of it. How does it apply to the deal of the century? It is what Khaled has described. Where we are now is not new and not a rupture and not a new juncture presented by the Trump administration, but in fact a steady path that has been paved since 1967 with the leadership of the US and Israel and the participation of the Palestinians, without which this would not have been possible. The deal of the century looks very much like an autonomous framework of Palestinian self-governance in 20 non-contiguous land masses throughout the West Bank whose territorial contiguity is cut by settlements, settlers, military infrastructure, bypass roads, firing zones, the apartheid wall, and all the facts on the ground that we don't want to talk about or look at a map to demonstrate. And the idea is if we pump enough money into them and Palestinians agree to it, then we've resolved the issue. It's a form of capitulation, and it's no surprise that it comes after the Trump administration has cut $364 million in humanitarian aid to UNRWA, to Palestinian refugees, and after cutting $200 million of aid to the US aid projects in the West Bank, including to East Jerusalem hospitals. This is duress that's being sold to us as a deal of the century, and it continues a legacy that Israel tried in the 1970s in the form of the village leagues, where it attempted to co-opt local Palestinian leaders willing to accept what they can get in and giving up in exchange for a national liberation movement. Then it failed, because the Palestinians understood that without the PLO, they would be giving up their claims to sovereignty and independence. But the deal of the century also has a predecessor, which is Oslo. We could not be here without Oslo. It has actually laid the groundwork. It's not that Israel violated Oslo, and that's why we have this reality today. It's because of Oslo that Israel was able to pave this reality today. Why? As a legal document, it's a horrible legal document, a horrible legal document. Let me just name a few things. There is no reference at all to international law. And I'm not talking about the controversial law, right? I'm not talking about final status solutions like 478 and the status of Jerusalem, Security Council Resolution 478. I'm not talking about 194 and the return of refugees. I'm talking about what Kissinger and the Nixon administration placed on the PLO as preconditions to the negotiations in their 1975 Memorandum of Understanding, which is that you must renounce violence, you must recognize Israel, and you must accept the terms of Security Council 242. Well, after 20 years of rejections, the Palestinians did that when they declared independence in 1988 on the basis of General Assembly Resolution 181 and Security Council Resolution 242. You would think that after 20 years, Israel would be ecstatic. And they renounced violence, they amended the PLO charter, and they rescinded Resolution 3379. What is left? And yet, it was in that moment that Israel changes the language of 242 and basically turns it, rather than being a resolution that mandates a particular outcome, it will now be descriptive in function. It will be descriptive instead of prescriptive, meaning that when the Palestinians and the Israelis agree, the terms of 242 will be achieved regardless of the contours of that achievement. And so you see that in Oslo. There is no reference to 242 or 338. And if the one reference to it in the Declaration of Principles of 1993 is that basically says that the terms of Oslo will be achieved, or 242 will be achieved when there is peace. So, as a legal scholar, looking at this, it seemed a little bit obvious. Like I intended to write the chapter about Oslo, basically detailing to lay people why the terms of the document were so bad. As a legal solution, we have a number of legal experts in the room who told the PLO that themselves. So I thought, well, that's not the story I wanted to. Anybody literate can tell you how bad this agreement is. The real question is, why did the PLO agree, and how did Israel achieve it? And so really quickly, again, Oslo, or what we see in the DOP, is verbatim what Menachem Begin and Anwar al-Sadat presented in their 1978 Middle East framework in the run-up to the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement. And it basically details that it'll be a 5-year process, 2-year interim process, 3-year final negotiating process on the final status issues of Jerusalem, refugees, borders, water, and I'm missing one. Settlements, obviously, verbatim, okay? That is what Oslo is. But in 1978, Palestinians rejected the 1978 framework and said no to autonomy, yes to the PLO. In 1993, the PLO agreed to this framework with 2 slightly modified differences. Number one, whereas the 1978 framework said that the leaders of this new autonomy framework would be locally elected leaders in Palestine, in 1993 it was the PLO itself who stepped in to take that role. And the other distinction is that where in 1978 it said that Palestinians will have governance over certain Palestinian individuals, in 1993 it said that they will have governance over those individuals and certain lands that they are on, right? So what explains that shift? And the explanation is basically that the PLO was trying to salvage itself. The 1982 Israeli invasion into Beirut, we cannot underestimate what the removal of the PLO from Beirut, where it had a base of something 300 to 400,000 Palestinians who were part of a parastatal institution, so to speak, their displacement, their leadership's dispersal, their movement to Tunisia, had on the attitude of the PLO and its strength. Compound that with the fact that the 1987 Intifada gave rise to a new leadership, Palestinian leadership, that directly threatened Arafat, including Hanan Ashrawi, Haidar Abd al-Shafi, and most notably Faisal al-Husseini. Now, also in 1987, Hamas establishes itself. And Hamas is directly saying that Israel, it rejects Israel, but it also is opposed to the PLO. The 1991 Gulf War happens. Arafat sides with Saddam Hussein. In response, the Gulf states are now shifting their financial support from the PLO to Hamas. This leads us to a condition of what Camille Mansour, who was a legal advisor in the negotiations, said. It was either entering the negotiations or basically accepting the National Liberation Movement altogether. So now the question is how. The brief answer of how Israel did this is they basically opened up a back channel in Norway, where their negotiators were not as adept as the negotiators in Madrid or in Washington, who had actually been obstinate, who saw the writing on the wall, according to the transcripts, evaded every single trap that Israel presented, that the negotiators in Oslo accepted. And the reason that they accepted it is because it wasn't a decision between a good agreement and a bad agreement, but just an agreement. How is the PLO to remain relevant? Right? Which gives rise to the question, should you let projects fail even if there is no alternative? That's a question we have to ask ourselves. Would this history of the present be different had we let that project fail and given space to new projects? Yasser Arafat was 44 years old when he took over the PLO in 1968. It was that youth, I believe, and that courageous vision that allowed him to set new paths forward, which is the same type of lack, what we have in our current Palestinian leadership, of frankly lacking vision. So I'll conclude by saying this. We are now in a state where Palestinians are stuck in a sovereignty trap. It is whereby Palestinians are able to exercise limited derivative sovereignty that is constantly subject to approval by their settler sovereign, which means that they will never be able to achieve full independence. How do you escape that sovereignty trap? In the book, I describe a comparison to the Namibian case study, which you may be interested in. Maybe you should ask me a question because I'm running out of time. But aside from the Namibian case study, which is very instructive, let me tell you this. Another way to think about it is thinking about it outside of the framework of sovereignty altogether. Sovereignty suggests a mutually exclusive equation where there can only be one sovereign. It's mutually exclusive, as opposed to frameworks of belonging, where it is not mutually exclusive, but could be mutually reinforcing. It is why, as an editorial committee member of the Journal of Palestine Studies, the intellectual, I guess, cadre, right, who do this work have shifted from thinking about this as a humanitarian law framework to a settler colonial framework, right? How we think about it shapes the future. I'll also point to the fact that Zena Agha, Al-Shabaka policy member, just recently published a memo on climate change and the effect on Palestine. In it, she details what it will mean for Palestinians if they are not able to escape the trap what climate change is doing to them. If we are unable to think of Palestinians as equals, deserving of human rights, dignity, of decentering Israel's priorities in order to achieve Palestinian livelihood, then maybe we should think about it of how do we, as a collective, escape the trappings and the doom that climate change is going to impose on all of us without distinction. Without distinction. And in fact, on the mention of climate change, I should say that the way that we approach the Palestinian question, or this conflict, is the same way we approach climate change. Regardless of the writing on the wall, the number of hurricanes, the number of floods, the amount of fires, the displacement, the sinking islands, we remain beholden to narratives that tell us that climate change is a hoax. And it is that same attitude where we are denying the empirical evidence on the ground in Palestine and Israel that is slow walking us into sure destruction. And so I hope that we are able to at least shift the way that we can think about it to imagine new horizons for the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for really very stimulating presentations, and I think really set the table for a good conversation, and we'll bring in the rest of the audience soon. But just to use a journalistic phrase, you kind of swallowed your lead at the end, which is setting new horizons. And I wanted to start off by asking you both, you know, we have reached a certain point, and I would say I accept Khaled's basic thesis, which is that Trump in many ways is just a continuation of a path that we've been on, really. And I would go back even beyond or before Clinton, and I think that your book lays out that really you can go back to Kissinger, you can go back even beyond that and find that the basic elements of where we are today were being put into place 45, 50 or more years ago. But Trump has also done something that the others, regardless of their failings, didn't do and refused to do, and that is that he's crossed the red lines of legality. And if you look at your thesis and your presentation, which is how the law has been shaped over the years in order to justify and legitimize the Israeli narrative at the expense of the Palestinians, what we've seen with Trump so far, in fact, I think as Khaled pointed out, just throws all of that in the trash and says, we don't care about the legality. We're not even going to maintain the pretense that all of his predecessors maintained of trying to justify on a legal basis what we're doing. Golan Heights is clearly a violation of international law. Jerusalem, clearly a violation of agreements that have been achieved over the years. And the administration's position is, well, so what? You know, we're operating on the basis of a new reality. So the question I have is, where do we go? And should the objective of people now who are trying to think of how do we salvage a vision of Palestinian self-determination and civil rights and human liberties. How do we salvage that out of the wreckage of what the Trump administration is inflicting? And what's the answer? Do we go back to that legal framework, or do we need to think about something entirely different? And so appreciate both of you to your comments.
I'll take a step first. I think we have one of two options. It's theoretically possible to go back to the old framework, legal, political framework, 242 and all that. I think it's very hard to imagine realistically undoing the damage that Trump has done. I don't know how I don't see even a very progressive Democratic administration moving the U.S. Embassy back to Tel Aviv. I don't see that happening. I see maybe other things that could be done to sort of level the playing field, maybe to recognize a Palestinian, a mission to a state of Palestine in Jerusalem, but something to help offset it. But I think it'll be very hard to imagine. I mean, I think the only way that an administration could try to bring back the old framework is to adopt an almost fundamentalist approach to, 242 is the word of God. And we are not going to accept loopholes. We're not going to water it down, which would be contrary to the past 50 years of American attitudes towards 242. They were beginning to water it down while it was being drafted, and then the minute it was enshrined, and then the debate about the French version versus the English and whatever. We've always been looking for ways to circumvent. So unless we have an administration that is going to lay down the law in a fundamentalist way and seriously hold Israel accountable to impose real costs to violations of international law, whether it's 242 or the Geneva Convention or the laws of war, to impose sanctions, then I don't see us going back to the old framework. And in that sense, I don't see it as realistic. So we have this vacuum. We have a political vacuum. We have a policy vacuum. We have a legal vacuum. And one of the reasons why I took this long approach is to see what analogs from history there were. What can we compare this moment to in the past 100 years? And the closest analog, I think, is the moment, is sort of the mid-1960s, before 1967 war, sort of like say 1966, let's say, when there was a PLO, but it was not really representative. There was a sense of Israeli kind of triumphalism and complacency. Israel was already at this point a regional superpower. It already had a nuclear program. There was a sense of Arab weakness and defeat. Of course, nothing like what we saw after '67, which is magnetized. And the old peace process, many people forget, before 242 and 338, there was 181 and 194. Those were the ground rules of the old peace process after 1948 that was spearheaded by the United Nations, 181 being the UN partition resolution, 194 being the resolution dealing with refugees. And between them, you had the terms of reference for all of the core issues of the conflict. Borders, refugees, and the status of Jerusalem were all addressed. And so any peace process at that time was based on those two resolutions in theory. By the time we get to actually very early on, it's sort of jettisoned, and they sort of, American officials and the international community just sort of pay lip service to it. By the time we get to 1966, it's completely forgotten. And I think that's the moment that we're in now, where we've had years of American administrations paying lip service to 242 while also trying to get out from underneath it. And we got to the point where the new Trump administration says, you don't have to pretend. Stop trying to fit the square peg in the round hole. Forget about the holes. Just call the square a circle, and we're done. that's kind of where we are now. So we have no rules of the game. There is no terms of reference. There is no peace process. And to make it even worse, we don't have a credible Palestinian leadership. And to me, this is the main sort of missing element. If you have a credible Palestinian leadership, then lots of things become possible. Like the Fedayeen groups only took over the PLO in 1968 and made it a truly representative, autonomous Palestinian body, independent of the Arab states. Between 1968 and 1974, there was an enormous change in the status of the PLO. Went from being a ragtag group of guerrilla warriors to now being feted at the United Nations, and even the American administration rolling out the red carpet for Yasser Arafat, and sort of putting the Palestinian issue on the global agenda. That happened in a very short period, but it happened because Palestinians exercised self-determination, not territorially, but politically and diplomatically, and they were able to change the political circumstances and force the Israelis and force the Americans to take them seriously in one form or another. That's what's missing, and I think that's what we'll need to fill the vacuum before we can think about what sort of new framework might exist. I think it will depend on what sort of Palestinian leadership exists, and do they have a new strategic consensus or a consensus around a new strategy going forward. Until we get that, I think we're going to be in this limbo of this netherworld of neither two states, not one, neither Hamas nor Fatah, neither this nor that. Is it an occupation? We don't know. But I think it will begin with a Palestinian initiative.
I completely agree with Khaled. The slight disagreement that I have, and it's this: it's that there has been a demand for reconstituting the PLO and a Palestinian National Council that governs the PLO, and that's what's been missing. That since 1993, in the invention of the Palestinian Authority, which was meant to be an administrative body to basically deliver mail, pick up garbage, and run municipal elections, has now come to supplant the national leadership, which represents the majority of Palestinians who live in exile and diaspora and not in the territories. 2/3 of Palestinians do not live in Palestine at all. So there's been a call, and a robust, I think very legitimate call. We need to reconstitute the PLO. That's what's caused us to go astray. I'm in slight disagreement, whereas first I did support this and was part of efforts to re-elect and to create new bodies, including here in the United States, in the U.S. Palestinian Community Network. Internationally, there's a transnational group of youth aged between 18 and 35 who are doing this work in the Palestinian Youth Movement. So there are initiatives. There's so much work that Palestinians have been doing relentlessly that we just don't pay enough attention to. And part of that is because it's a little bit radical to see Palestinians speak for themselves, right? We're often spoken on behalf of. And if we speak for ourselves and we say things that cut against the grain, then we're either idealistic, too passionate, not pragmatic, too close to the issue, in ways that we're not listening to and looking at what paths are already being paved. Why do I disagree with this slightly? Because I think even if we had a leadership, a more credible leadership, without a vision, what are they to do? What are they to do? And part of the problem is that Palestinians have not been given the space, enough breathing room to even dream of new worlds possible, right? What is it that Palestinians can think of outside of the narrow framework that's been placed on us since 1947? The UN Special Committee on Palestine presented to the Palestinians 3 solutions forward, right? A federalist Palestinian state with strong minority protections for the Jewish minority, 2 states, 1 for the Arabs, 1 for the Jews, and a binational state. What happens when Palestinians are able to imagine something completely different in a way forward? What I've been suggesting is that vision has to be something that we offer to Jewish Israelis that will offer them something better in a path forward than Israel has been able to offer them, right? What Mahmoud Mamdani terms as the turning point in South Africa and the Mandela moment, when Nelson Mandela ceased to solely be a representative of Black South Africa, but became a representative of all South Africa. And so how do we have that space to even dream these things forward? And I think that's what needs to be done. What happens as a prerequisite even without that vision, right? And I think that the prerequisite is, regardless of your political association, affiliation, vision, let's say you're the most ardent two-stater, right? You must oppose Oslo as a matter of principle and logic, because Oslo has destroyed the two-state solution. Not anywhere in any of the documents is a Palestinian state even mentioned. It is not the ultimate outcome. The outcome is the outcome we see today, which is autonomy. So you must oppose Oslo as a prerequisite. Number two, we have to get outside of the US's sphere of influence. The US has dominated these talks, and it's that bilateralism and the domination of the US as the mediator, which has also stunted other internationalist approaches and solutions that have been offered. And in fact, one of the main reasons that Namibia was able to succeed is because it rejected all South African overtures to enter a Southwest African and a South African negotiating process, and it insisted on multilateralism. So even if we can't agree on this vision or the leadership, we must agree that Oslo must fall because it's part of the problem, and that the US is also the part of the problem, as is bilateralism. And so this is what's really sad about the current Palestinian leadership. They recognize the US now as part of the problem, which is why they're boycotting the negotiations. But they haven't boycotted the US. They're waiting for the new administration to come in, to continue the process. How disheartening is that? It is the reason they have not even endorsed the very minimum of boycott, divestment, and sanctions at this turning point, is because they're waiting for, right? They're waiting for climate change to reverse itself.
That's let me and on that point, let me go a little bit beyond either of your books and talk a little bit about what alternative kinds of negotiating processes we might imagine. One, you could make the argument, I would make the argument, that the extremism of the Trump administration, in fact, hasn't been necessarily a bad thing for the Palestinians, because in many ways it's opened up space for debate about the whole context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the relationship of the United States to that issue. And that you hear voices now in the United States who are arguing that the United States needs to take an entirely different approach. So what is your thinking about that development, and whether or not that might not lead to a different kind of U.S. engagement on the Israeli-Palestinian issue in the future? So that's one point. The second point is, as you say, I mean, there have been initiatives, and again, Khaled lays out a number of them over the course of the years, the quartet and other UN engagement and others, where perhaps people were putting on the table different kinds of approaches and a different way of thinking about the problem, and maybe a way of thinking about it that's more balanced. So far, we haven't really seen any indication that those elements, that those voices are coming back. I mean, even in the face of what I think everybody acknowledges is the bankruptcy of the Trump approach. But we haven't seen any of those voices coming back. We haven't seen any reassertion of the international community of interest in trying to take on and propose new ways of looking at this problem. So what are your thoughts about these two possibilities? Do you see any prospect, any hope that the United States itself is going to change its approach and become perhaps a more balanced and honest broker, if you will? And if that's not a possibility in your view, do you see other voices coming forward, either in the United Nations or other contexts, that might in fact become an alternative mediator?
So, go first, so that you can have the last word. Okay. So a couple of things about ways forward and the space for ways forward. Let me share one of them. I mean, a good friend of mine, a colleague, when I was writing the book, I was stuck and said to me, share what is the most obvious thing to you, which is actually your contribution. And I think the most obvious thing to me should be obvious to almost everybody in this situation in response to your question, which is that the way forward has to be a form of pressure on Israel rather than appeasement. As much as we want to think that this is about getting two sides to connect with one another, there's just no parity. It makes no logical sense. Palestinians can't arrest any Israelis. Palestinians can't demolish Israeli homes. Palestinians can't bomb any Israeli, with warplanes, right? Mass bomb Israeli cities in 51-day campaigns. Palestinians can't tell Netanyahu that he's not allowed to travel, okay? So when we're thinking about what is the most obvious thing here, it has to be this idea that we need to shift course in order to place pressure on a state that has not complied with any basic norms that are delineated in natural law, in human rights law, and in international law. And it takes me back to what happened in the aftermath of the 1967 war when one of the U.S. administration officials cables the Johnson administration after Israel basically found itself as now capturing all of this land it didn't expect in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai, and the Golan Heights. It was now an empire. It was an imperial power in the course of 6 days. And the U.S. administration official cables the Johnson administration and says, even sanctions won't achieve pushing back Israel. We'd have to do it by force. They want to stay. And that has been obvious to us. And Israel Netanyahu has said over and over, all we have to do is listen to him. There will be no Palestinian state. There will be no Palestinian state. There will never return to the 67 borders. Settlements will remain. So really, the most obvious thing is we need to apply pressure, and we're so reticent to do it. Even pro-peace organizations here in Washington who believe in Palestinian self-determination are reticent. They want to approach Israel as a friend rather than apply pressure. But in what historical example has any dominant community, state, power relinquished their privileges voluntarily because of a change of heart? White people in the United States didn't do it to end de jure segregation and to provide the vote for our black brothers and sisters. Men didn't do it when they allowed women to vote in 1921. It was because women took that vote. It was pressure. South Africa didn't do it. It was an international campaign. Name one example where a dominant power relinquished their privileges voluntarily, and I might be convinced. And so here I think the most obvious thing about moving forward is we need to shift the way we think about this and what's necessary. In a way that doesn't seem it's unfair, but begin to think of Palestinians and Jewish Israelis as sharing the same fate. And perhaps we'll be a little bit more empathetic to achieving some sort of Palestinian dignity without constantly juxtaposing it of, well, what will it mean to Israel for Palestinians to live with dignity? How much will it take away from them, right? So that's my obvious takeaway.
It's funny because when I listen to Noura, I feel like she's almost reading verbatim from my book. And I know that she's not.
Plagiarism.
No, I know that she's not. But I mean, it shows you the extent to which we sort of at two different starting points, we arrived at the same conclusion. The peace process, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, if you like irony and you like paradoxes and contradictions, you will love my book, and you will love, any sort of telling of the peace process story, because it's actually a remarkable narrative on how not to conduct any conflict resolution process. It's the exact opposite of a normal logical mediation process, where whoever thought that it would be logical that if you put all the pressure on the weak side and no pressure on the strong side, that will somehow produce what? A worsening of the status quo? You're exacerbating the conflict. And that's exactly what's happened. And that's why I say, only half snarky, the peace process really is what killed the two-state solution. In terms of thinking of alternative strategies, sort of go back to my previous point, and just to clarify, I'm not only, when I say we need a new Palestinian leadership, we need a new Palestinian leadership with a new vision. Otherwise, it's not a new Palestinian
Right,
leadership.
right.
Other, it's just new faces. Well, we have new faces. We have a new prime minister, and we can shake up the cabinet, and you can replace the executive committee members on the PLO. But what you need is a new vision that is the product of a Palestinian consensus. You know, the old PLO was very good at cobbling together consensus. And it's actually quite remarkable when you look at other expatriate or exile movements like the Libyan opposition or the Syrian opposition, and look how dysfunctional they are and how unable they are to sort of put together a consensus amongst themselves that can then become politically effective and on the diplomatic level. Well, the PLO did that in the 1970s and the 1980s. And you know, you have these disparate groups, Arab states sponsoring different factions, working at cross purposes, and yet there was one single Palestinian address. It's a pretty remarkable thing when you look at it in comparative terms, to establish this state-like entity with no territorial base. But when the PLO went into decline is when they abandoned that consensus-building model. You know, this is why I always argue, people say we need new elections. Elections aren't going to fix your problem. Elections, in a way, got you into this problem of Hamas versus Fatah because one side won and the other side didn't like the outcome. And of course, they had international backing for not liking the outcome. So what you need more important than elections is that consensus on the basic ground rules of any process, of any internal process. So then you can have elections, as we say, للصبح, until morning. But until then, elections really, I think, are problematic. So that's why I think it begins and ends with the Palestinians, because it's very hard to generate solidarity for something that you don't know what direction it's moving in. Are we pushing for, when we say end the occupation, what does that mean? Does that mean the result is two states, two sovereign states? Does that mean one state? We don't have a consensus among Palestinians. It's very hard, I think, for allies of the Palestinians to get behind something that they're not really clear what the goal is, or to get behind an issue when the authors of that issue are so dysfunctional. How are we going to support the Palestinians when the Palestinians aren't supporting the Palestinians? Palestinian leaders aren't supporting the Palestinians. So it's hard to get very, very enthusiastic. And so that's why I think you need a new vision, a new strategy, probably a new leadership, perhaps new institutions. I don't know. The PLO maybe can be reformed. Maybe it needs to be replaced. I don't know. But I do think it starts there. Until we have that, I think we're going to have to get used to living with uncertainty. It's very unsatisfying, especially for an analyst. People want some certainty. X will happen if you do Y. But there is no certainty. We live in this very amorphous area where two states is probably not going to happen, but one state isn't going to happen either, because I don't see a political constituency or a critical mass on either side pushing in that direction, the way we used to have around a two-state solution. So it's neither one state, and it's not two states. And who are we supporting? Are we supporting the thousands of people on the border? That's important. But if we learned anything at all from what we used to call the Arab Spring is you can't just have movement. You can have 1 million people in Tahrir Square every week, but if they don't have a political message and they don't have a political infrastructure, an organizational infrastructure to achieve that vision, then it's all for naught. Political constituencies need political leaderships. And I think that's, the grassroots stuff is very, very important, but it's not a substitute, I think, for a credible political leadership. And I think until we have that on the Palestinian side, we're not going to see any any change. We're going to sort of be in this netherworld of sort of floating around and not really sure what's going on, and people will naturally gravitate to whatever new shiny object is thrown into the arena. And right now, the new shiny object is this deal of the century, which we all know is basically a sham, but it's new and it's different.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, because I think that there's ways forward, right? There's the negative asks and then there's the positive asks, right? We all know this. Like your negative ask is just the removal of the things you don't like. The positive is the creation of the new world. And I agree with you on the positive asks that we definitely need a definitive political leadership. But do we need to wait for that to make our negative asks of ending the siege?
No.
Right? So that there are some things that we can achieve.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think history has shown also that a lot of times the process of raising those asks, when if you look at the 1936 revolt, right? It not only was a revolt against the British and the Zionist project, it was a revolt against their own leadership in the same moment, and they sort of swept away the old elites who were totally detached, and so that was a natural outcome of this organic rebellion, and so I think you can't really separate the one from the other. If we're going to have a grassroots movement, I think it can part of its development can include defining, creating, or reforming a political leadership as part of putting its asks on the agenda. Because what is a leadership? Leadership is a vehicle to deliver your asks or to deliver your basic message, whether it's to your own constituency or to the international community. So I think it's much more organically connected.
Okay. Well, we're going to plunge into the uncertainty of asking our audience for their questions. So if you want, we have a microphone circulating. Do we have? Yeah. So why don't we start over here? Okay. Here, this gentleman in the. And please state your name and affiliation and ask your question.
My name is Mustafa. I'm a student with the University of Maryland University College, and thank you very much for having this conversation today. I'm learning a lot, and thank you very much for your elaboration and professional presentation. I'm not literate with a lot of things you said, so I have to learn. On one thing I wanted to comment about the law of war. That's I'm a generation of war from Afghanistan, so. There's no law in the war. We have expression or saying in Farsi, it says, no one distributes halwa during the war. Halwa is a sweet that we make at home. So the law is in the hands of those people. They have military infrastructure and they have the international community on their side. So that's the law. I just wanted to ask Noura a question about what is one thing. I've been listening and hearing about Israel-Palestine conflict since I was born. I don't remember, but it was BBC that I was hearing to it all the time, and it was always talking about what's happening. So I was grown up with this situation. What is one thing you want to bring to the table today in the international community and say, hey, we want to get rid of Hamas, we want to get rid of whatever is in there that's in opposition with Israeli demand, and what is that one thing? I know that majority of Israelis, they support the two-state, the public support the two-state, but not the government. But the same thing is on the Palestine side. There's no public opinion. It's always Hamas or the PLO. Do we need a new institution or reform or something that the people can have a voice there? Thank you.
So I think Khaled and I covered a lot of the idea of these leaderships. I think I've shared what my one demand would be, which is, I made several. Listen to Palestinians, change the framework, put pressure on Israel, right? Stop thinking within these strictures because the answers are already there, the leadership is there, the youth are there. If there's people who represent foundations here in Washington, you know, we have to, here's another concrete ask. We have made the foundations who have supported Palestinian life in the West Bank and Gaza have basically alleviated the responsibility of Israel as an occupying power to actually be providing those services, and we've actually just sustained the occupation and made it more viable. And that's precisely, we're going to see more of that in the economic plan of the deal of the century. And so one way to think different about it is, why don't foundations actually fund Palestinian initiatives where there are youth who are dreaming? Give them the space to dream, because they don't have it. And every time they speak, you know, there's somebody who's going to say, you're a traitor, you're abandoning the points of national unity. And so that's another ask. But as for you, this was not your question, but of course I always read into people's questions, this thing about demanding that Hamas be removed in order for a way forward. Just really quickly, I don't support Hamas, I don't support Fatah. This is not, you know, I'm committed, and I'm not even supportive of necessarily a Palestinian state. I'm committed to our collective thriving. What can we do? And that's a question that everybody is asking, right? The Rohingya are asking that. Children here, the fifth migrant minor died in US custody yesterday, right? So it's a question we need to be asking. So it's not restricted to Palestinians. That's my point. But why do people always bring up Hamas? And I think it's problematic that we don't scrutinize that Hamas was established in 1987. And the Palestinians had been waging a liberation struggle well before that. And Israel had been imposing harm on Palestinians well before that. So it couldn't be, Israel can't be doing everything that it's doing in response to Hamas. It didn't launch its first rocket suicide bomber into Israel until 1994, but Israel circumscribed the Gaza Strip in 1993 in preparation for peace. As a peace overture, actually built the first fence that we see has now manifested and culminated in the complete enclosure of Gaza. Didn't launch its first rocket into Israel until 2001. And yet the apartheid wall had started to be built in 2000, and Israel had begun its policy of extrajudicial assassinations in 2000 as well, in the midst of the second Palestinian uprising known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada. So we need to start scrutinizing, is this really about Hamas? If Hamas disappeared, would Israel really end the siege of the Gaza Strip? Ask yourself seriously that question. People are laughing. I hope that's because this is so obvious, right? But what is also obvious is that Israel has also termed every Palestinian leader as not an adequate partner for peace. They called Yasser Arafat not a partner for peace. They even called Abu Mazen not a partner for peace, even though Abu Mazen has been the most conciliatory Palestinian leader, has given everything that the US has asked for, and exchange has only seen Palestinian state taken off the table, refugees taken off the table, Jerusalem taken off the table, right? In response for that conciliation, and Israel still calls Abu Mazen not a partner for peace. So when they say Hamas is not a partner for peace, you know, we just be a little bit more scrutinizing. I don't think this is about Hamas.
Thank you. We'll take a question. The lady in the back over here. And maybe we'll ask Mr. Salem for his question. Okay.
Hi, my name is Maya Tabet, and I'm the associate editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies. I had a question for you, Khaled. You said that there was one analogous moment to this one in the 60s before the 67 war, and you described why you thought they were analogous. And I want to push back on that because I feel that the geopolitical situation in the world is very, very different. And 9/11 has happened, and Israel has taken off as the world's, you know, drone, surveillance, securitization, militarization empire. And I don't see this as at all analogous to the 60s. We're also getting to the end of fossil fuels, and it's going to get very ugly because there's not very much left, and the guys with the big guns, you know, they're the ones who are going to enforce this continued living high up on the hog. So I wonder what you would respond to that.
Okay, thanks. And let's have Mr. Salem's question. No, we were going to.
Thanks, Jerry. And thank you both for excellent presentations. I think you both analyze the problem in very interesting ways, and you have a lot of facts to support your conclusions. But I didn't hear a prescription for the future from either of you. You know, some of us are still engaged in the legal strategy. You know, we just won in the Court of Appeals the issue of Israeli settlements being supported by U.S. charities. Now we've got another trial. It's going to be a long, long process, but the funding of settlements by U.S. charities like Friends of Beit Il, Friends of the IDF, is in play now. It wasn't before. And a number of us have been involved in that effort. Are there other legal strategies, Noura, that could be used here and elsewhere? And to both of you, if you were God for a day, what would you do? What prescription do you have for the future? Is it one state? Is it legitimate resistance and just saying, okay, here are the keys, you take over everything? Is it a different strategy on two states? And how do you assess the sentiment of the Palestinian people living under occupation?
Okay. Thanks, George. And let's go ahead and ask this gentleman in the camel coat, and that'll be the third question. We'll wrap up. Please identify yourself.
My question is, the Obama administration, Palestinians, been politics first. And my question really is, what is infrastructure now maybe, park building infrastructure, water self-desalination, development of Gaza marine gas? Is that a possible way of moving forward now in view of the difficulty of doing things political? I'm an engineer in the West Bank. I said, why don't we look at infrastructure bottoms up while we find the difficulty in moving forward in the political realm?
Thank you.
Sure. Do you want to answer my question?
Which one? The world's a different place. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. Obviously, the world is a very different place. Yeah, on the question of the analog of the 60s versus today. You know, it's a very crude comparison, but it's the one it's the moment that I see most analogous to where we are, at least within the confines of this issue. Obviously, the world is very different, but it's different on so many levels. In the works in both directions. In those days, we lived in a very bipolar world. There was the Soviet Union and its clients and satellites, and there was the United States and its clients and satellites. Today, we don't live in a bipolar world. We live in a very multipolar world. So that creates new opportunities, I think, for especially the Palestinians. We have much more access to information. There's sort of a democratization of the availability of information, so that you have citizen journalists, someone in Hebron can live tweet an experience as it's happening, broadcast it to the world without going through traditional media of, you contact a reporter, you try to get a film crew. People are now their own storytellers. Ordinary citizens are now telling their own stories and broadcasting it to the world. That's different. That changes the power dynamics also, because that helps to level the playing field much more in the Palestinians' favor. So the world is different in lots of ways, but I was speaking strictly within the confines of a peace process and Israelis and Palestinians, and how we looked at the world. As far as prescriptions for the future, Noura can talk about legal strategies and other things. It's not my area. But what would I do? I think I keep going. I'm sort of a broken record. I keep going back to this same point about Palestinian political leadership. I don't think anything can happen in the absence of a credible, minimally credible Palestinian leadership with minimal legitimacy. It can be the current leadership with buy-in from all the Palestinian factions, some cobbled together some new consensus, or it could be a totally different leadership because the old leadership is seen as ineffective and so they get swept away. I don't have a preference. I'm only looking at it from the outside and saying, whatever direction it goes, we don't have a minimally credible Palestinian leadership that can be the vehicle for and the address for any new initiatives, political or diplomatic. And I think in the absence of that, it's very disorienting. The Palestinian public doesn't know where to turn. They're kind of moving in different directions. And the international community is sort of at a loss of what to push because they don't really see a credible interlocutor who they can say, who can articulate their demands in a coherent way. So, I go back to this idea of Palestinians need to fix their house, whatever that means. Replace, reform, reconstitute, whatever it is, they need a credible political leadership because when they don't have one, bad things happen. And I would point to moments like 1948 and 1967 when there wasn't a credible Palestinian leadership and very, very bad things happened. It's not to say that having a Palestinian leadership suddenly inoculates them from any catastrophe, but it is a mitigating factor. And I just don't see a way forward without it. Dissolving the PA, that's an option. I think the law of institutional inertia, which is something I just made up, it probably dictates that institutions don't dissolve themselves voluntarily. They get destroyed or replaced. But the idea that the PA one day is going to say, you know what, we're not going to exist anymore. All the benefits that we've been getting, we unilaterally surrender. We no longer want them. It's just not going to happen that way. The PA could collapse involuntarily, and I think that becomes more and more likely every day. But I don't see it happening absent some major alternative, which is we're going to replace the PA with X or Y or Z, and that I don't see. Simple things like a passport. So you dissolve the PA, then the very next day, how do you leave the West Bank to go to Jordan if you don't have a PA passport anymore? Never mind who's taking out the trash and cleaning the streets and fixing the roads and let's not forget passing out favors. A big part of the PA is it's a jobs program, it's a patronage program. How do you replace that? What kind of new services and who's performing those services? So there are lots of questions. Again, I feel like they need to be answered by a Palestinian leadership with a new vision as part of an internal Palestinian conversation, which currently isn't happening. On the question of development of Gaza and infrastructure and things like that, I mean, developing Gaza's gas resources there's enormous potential. There's a lot of potential wealth that can be derived from that, and I see that as another bone of contention between these rival Palestinian forces of Hamas and Fatah, who are going to inevitably compete over control over those resources. So I don't see those being exploited without, again, a Palestinian consensus on how to move forward. And that's one reason why they're not being exploited, and frankly, why Israel is able to exploit them, because Palestinians are, still quibbling. An Israeli friend of mine described it as, two bald men fighting over a comb. Is essentially where Palestinian politics is today.
So let me combine what I heard in George's question about the sentiment of the Palestinian people actually overlaps with this, and I'll get to the other question about vision, but overlaps with this question about infrastructure. And what I hear inherent is that what is this, what is this visionary work that you're trying to do when there is a basic desire to live to live with some modicum of security of your child not being, shot on the way home, of, what happened last 2 weeks ago when Siba Abu Arrar, a 1-year-old infant, was killed because of Israeli shrapnel in the Gaza Strip, where your child does not have to fear, you don't have to fear over your child's life because there's nowhere safe in Gaza, right? So I get that question. I also think that there's ways we can answer that without giving up. It's not mutually exclusive with thinking broader. And it reminds me, I debated Daniel Reisner, who was who has been a Netanyahu advisor and was the lead architect of the new laws of war during the Second Intifada, or the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and who also was a negotiator with the Jordanian-Israel agreement. And after he heard me speak, and I'm sure Washingtonians probably have the same kind of response to my tone, he basically said to me, in my experience, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza are much more amenable negotiators than Palestinians in the diaspora. And what he's basically saying is that because we don't live under the same stress, that our demands are much more visionary, right? And I understand that, but I also think it's the work, it's that dream work that peoples under subjugation must do in order to imagine a future that's worthwhile to fight for. It's like the difference between asking everyone here in this room and asking prisoners in a penitentiary, right? What would be fair wages? And then telling the people here, well, you don't make any sense. It's much more amenable to talk to prisoners who have no choice. And on this note, especially just to emphasize that 2/3 of the Palestinian people live in diaspora. And so there's no way to exclude us. There's no way to exclude that and to limit it, which has been part of the Israeli strategy. What about then, if I say all that, then what about the future? What about that dream work? And here let me say, if I had the answer, I would definitely not be in the academy. But I would be on the ground and on the road building it, right? I don't have the answer. What I'm trying to do is to provoke us to think in new ways, to shake off the fear of sounding unreasonable, not pragmatic, to be able to do that work, and especially for Palestinians who have been stuck, right? That's what I'm doing. So what is my provocation and my offering? What I offer here, and I hope to continue to build on in my thinking and my writing and my next book project, is this idea of the way forward, regardless of what the status solution looks like, has to be predicated on a process of decolonization. And what does that mean? We have historic examples of what decolonization means and what settler decolonization means, two very different things, right? In a colonial framework, you just want the colonial power to leave, right? Think British India. In a settler colonial situation, the outcome could be different. They could leave as the French left Algeria, or they could stay as they did in South Africa, right? And those outcomes are subject, depending on the vision of how we decide, how we decide to end it, that domination. The one thing that those two things have in common, those at least two case studies I'm mentioning, and there's others, is that you have to alter the relationship between the settler sovereign and the native population. It cannot be based on what historically mediates the relationship, which is that the settler sovereign's preferences dominate and that the native must accept whatever is left. You have to alter that relationship about what is the way forward. And the way that I propose that we do that is a few things. Number one, I propose that rather than imagine the right of return of Palestinian refugees and the return of refugees as the outcome of struggle, Palestinians have been liberated when refugees return, instead to imagine that as the beginning of the new future. So now that Palestinians have returned, what is the new way to organize this society that is actually a just and equitable outcome? And think about it. So the return of Palestinian refugees no longer becomes the triumph. It becomes the beginning of the challenge. And it is inherently a return to an unknown future, because Palestinian refugees will never return to 1947 Palestine. They're returning to a new reality, where a family of 10 is probably now an extended family of 150 trying to be in the same home, right? So this is for everyone thinking about ways forward. Which may not even, if it still exists, right, in that scenario. But then what does that mean in thinking about Israel? The way that I propose thinking about Israel now is to think, since Israel's establishment and its visioning, the vision of Israel, it's been envisioned as a satellite state in the Middle East and a site of ingathering for a global Jewish population. It has never been envisioned as a part of the Middle East. So despite all Zionist claims of nativity and indigeneity to this land, they have not returned to their Arab Middle Eastern roots. They have returned to basically achieve acceptance within Europe. They have returned to demonstrate their eligibility as part of a European civilizational project, which is why Israel, since its founding, has been intent on structuring itself based on a European Jewish history. It's what Ella Shohat, an Iraqi Jewish cultural studies scholar, describes of her family who went from Iraq to Israel as basically mandating a process of self-devastation for Arab Jews from Morocco and Algeria and Yemen and Tunisia and Lebanon and Egypt, right? So what happens when Israel begins to imagine itself as actually being part of the Middle East rather than a satellite in the Middle East? And then we can start to think about what happens then when we elevate the lives of Middle Eastern Jews who are also subject to an intense amount of racial violence by the Israeli state, who then get to determine the outcome. How do you rehabilitate Israel to create that new future? Right? Provocative. Provocative. But that's what I'm insisting on. Let's make that provocation and create space to think about the Arab Jew no longer as the Mizrahim, but instead as the Arab Jew. The reason Israel doesn't refer to its Arab Jewish population as Arab Jews is because they reserve that moniker for the Palestinian Israelis in order to deny them their national rights and in order to bifurcate an Arab Jewish identity within Israel. So that the Arab Jews basically don't learn Arabic, don't learn about their cultural history in Iraq or Yemen, for example. It's the whole project is to not be in the Middle East and yet to insist on indigeneity in the Middle East. So how does the return of Palestinian refugees help Israel become part of the Middle East? So that's my vision. That's what I want. Where I want to start.
On that note, thank you very much. We have copies of Blind Spot available outside, and Khaled will be signing them. We don't have copies of Justice for Some, not because we didn't try, but perhaps Noura will sign autographs. I don't know. But Justice for Some is available at Kramer's, at Politics and Prose, at other local bookstores.
On Amazon at Stanford.
Well, we don't advertise Amazon.
Oh, the SUP Press at Target. Blah, blah, blah.
But thank you to Khaled and to Noura for a fascinating presentation. Thank you to all of you for coming and sharing this time with us.